Welcome to NOAA Science, where America's extreme weather nightmare begins. Tornadoes, floods, blizzards, fire, solar storms. Under one sprawling sky, distant hazards awaken together before most people realize they share one engine. Across North America, one planetary arrangement lets the same atmosphere produce many conflicting disasters simultaneously. High above a deep trough and fast jet stream shortwaves keep this outbreak organized for days. From the Gulf, warm, humid air keeps streaming north, repeatedly reloading fuel for violent storms. Along the dry line, desert air collides with moisture, creating a narrow, explosive dividing zone. Inside the warm sector, instability deepens as stored buoyancy gathers beneath colder air aloft tonight. With height winds strengthen and turn, giving storms the rotation needed to become dangerous supercells. By evening, the atmosphere does not relax. It rearranges, carrying daytime energy into darkness ahead. After sunset, organized storms can intensify unseen, making nighttime tornadoes harder to detect and survive. Day by day, the target shifts eastward, while the broader pattern keeps replenishing severe potential. Earlier storms leave hidden boundaries behind, resetting the atmosphere and helping later rounds ignite faster. Far from tornado country, the same circulation redistributes water, cold, and wind into new threats. In western New York, saturated ground and persistent rain drive rivers beyond their normal limits. On the cold flank, Arctic air and strong lift turn moisture into snow and blizzard conditions. West of the storm-core drought, dry fuels and fierce gusts create dangerous fire weather. Now the map widens again, revealing alarms multiplying across regions that rarely share the same emergency. Across the country, overlapping alerts, strained forecasters, responders, utilities, and the public's attention at once. Beyond weather, a solar storm arrives, painting auroras while following completely different physical rules tonight. As Earth churns below, a moon launch rises within the Artemis era's unsettling atmospheric backdrop. Like, subscribe, and thank you for listening. Now let's open the continental pattern above North America. Across North America, the pattern settles into a broad and unusually efficient arrangement, one that allows a single atmospheric system to express itself in several different forms at the same time. Over the center of the continent, air masses with very different histories move toward one another and hold their contrasts across long distances. Warm, moist air rises northward from the Gulf of Mexico and spreads through the lower part of the atmosphere over the plains and lower Mississippi Valley. To the west, drier air extends out from the elevated deserts and plateaus, carrying a very different temperature and moisture profile. Farther north and northwest, colder air descends from higher latitudes and from the Canadian interior, pressing southward behind the main circulation. At the scale of the whole map, the continent becomes a meeting ground between moisture, dryness, cold, and spring warmth. And that meeting does not occur at a single point. It stretches across thousands of miles. So the same parent pattern supports flooding in one region, heavy snow in another, severe thunderstorms in another, and dangerous fire weather along the dry edge in between. The structure is not random. It reflects the geography of the continent itself, where open north to south pathways allow air to travel with relatively little obstruction, while mountain chains in the west guide the movement of dry air and help sharpen the contrast between air masses. The result is a continental collision zone, broad in appearance but precise in its consequences. In the eastern half of the country, moisture has room to advance. Over the central plains, contrasting air types meet along long boundaries that can focus rising motion. Across the northern tier, colder air remains available on the back side of the larger circulation. On the western and southwestern side, descending dry air and strong surface winds support a very different hazard landscape. Nothing in this pattern requires separate storms for each outcome. The same large arrangement can produce all of them because each region sits under a different expression of the same circulation. On the warm side, air near the ground becomes more buoyant as moisture deepens and temperatures rise, creating an environment favorable for powerful thunderstorms when lifting begins. On the cold side, rising air cools through a deeper layer that remains below freezing, so precipitation falls as snow and can be driven by wind into blizzard conditions. Between those zones where the air is dry and the pressure gradient strengthens, weather grows more dangerous because vegetation loses moisture, while gusts increase the speed of any flame front. Farther east and northeast, the moisture stream that feeds severe storms also loads the river basins and saturated soils with repeated rainfall, allowing runoff to accumulate beyond what the ground can absorb. In a calmer season, these hazards might arrive one after another. In this pattern, they exist together, organized by the same continental geometry. The atmosphere does not treat the country as separate weather stories. It behaves as one connected fluid system moving over one connected landmass. From space, the outlines of that system would appear as sweeping bands and arcs rather than isolated local events. Near the surface, however, the experience changes from one state to the next because the same circulation meets different terrain, different land cover, and different background air. Plains grasslands respond differently from forested hills, and broad river valleys respond differently from high open country. Yet the larger map remains coherent. Moisture continues northward through the central and eastern states. Colder air continues to wrap around the backside of the circulation. Dryness holds on the western flank. The boundaries between these regions become the quiet architecture of the outbreak. Even before individual storms begin, the arrangement is already present. It exists in dew point fields, in pressure patterns in the position of fronts, and in the gradual sharpening of temperature contrasts over distance. These features may seem abstract on a weather map, but together they define where energy can accumulate and where it can be released. They also explain why the hazard footprint covers such a large share of the continent at once. The center of the nation lies beneath a corridor where spring warmth and moisture can move quickly, while the north remains cold enough to support winter weather and the west remains dry enough to support fire. This seasonal tension is common in general form, yet on some weeks it tightens into a more concentrated state. In those periods, the gradients become stronger, the transport of air becomes more sustained, and the dividing lines between regions grow more active. That is the condition taking shape here. It is not a single dramatic object moving across a blank map. It is a set of large-scale relationships locking into place over several days. The continent supplies the raw contrasts. The atmosphere organizes them. Where warm, humid air spreads under cooler air aloft, instability increases. Where colder air deepens behind the circulation snow, and blowing snow become more likely. Where the dry side remains exposed to strong winds, the land dries further, and ignition risk grows more serious. Where repeated moisture transport intersects basins and already wet-ground rivers respond. Each outcome belongs to the same arrangement, and each one depends on position within it. This is why the national picture can seem contradictory only when viewed in pieces. Tornado conditions in one corridor, flood conditions in another, blizzard conditions farther north. And fire conditions on the western edge may appear unrelated to local observers, yet at continental scale they fit together with clean physical logic. North America in this pattern behaves like a wide stage set for competing air masses, and the stage is open from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border. The broadest view reveals the essential fact. The event begins not with one storm cloud or one warning box, but with the continent itself arranged in a way that permits many kinds of extreme weather to emerge at once under one governing pattern. Above the visible weather at the surface, the larger structure takes shape in the middle and upper atmosphere, where the flow of air becomes the organizing frame for everything beneath it. In this pattern, the key feature is an upper-level trough, a broad southward dip in the river of fast winds that circles the hemisphere. On a weather map, it appears as a bend in the height lines and the jet stream, but in physical terms, it marks a region where colder air aloft presses farther south and where the atmosphere becomes more favorable for lifting, turning, and repeated storm development. A simple trough often moves steadily from west to east, sweeping weather through a region and then allowing the atmosphere behind it to settle. This one behaves in a more persistent way. Instead of passing through as a single impulse, it carries smaller disturbances within it, compact packets of energy that rotate around the main trough and emerge one after another. Meteorologists often describe these as short waves, meaning smaller-scale ripples embedded within the broader flow. Each one matters, because each one enhances rising motion when it approaches, and each one can help generate a new surface response beneath it. The important point is that the larger system does not spend its energy all at once. It releases it in stages. That creates the feeling of an atmosphere that reloads rather than concludes. As one round of organized weather begins to weaken, another source of lift arrives aloft and renews the process. The upper pattern therefore acts less like a passing front and more like a machine with multiple moving parts, each timed closely enough to sustain the whole. The trough also changes the wind field through depth. Winds near the surface may come from the south or southeast, carrying moisture northward, while winds higher up veer toward the southwest, and then west as height increases. This turning with height is one of the signatures of organized severe weather, but it begins with the large-scale arrangement overhead. The trough places stronger winds over the central and southern United States, while also creating areas of divergence aloft, meaning regions where air spreads outward at high levels. When air spreads outward above replacement, air tends to rise from below. That vertical connection is one of the quiet foundations of storm development. It is a structural condition, a way of easing mass out of the upper column so that lower air can continue ascending. In a persistent setup, repeated zones of divergence accompany repeated embedded waves, so the lifting environment renews itself across more than one day. The trough also influences temperature structure through depth. Colder air aloft overspreads warmer air near the ground, increasing instability where moisture is present. The atmosphere becomes easier to overturn because the contrast between lower warmth and upper cold grows stronger. At the same time, on the back side of the trough descending, and colder air support the winter weather branch of the same system. This is why the same upper feature can be associated with thunderstorms in one sector and snow in another, without contradiction. It is creating a three-dimensional circulation in which different sectors inherit different vertical profiles. Near the base of the trough, where the southward dip reaches its lowest latitude, the flow often becomes especially important because that is where embedded disturbances round the corner and begin to accelerate east or northeast. Their movement helps intensify pressure falls at the surface, strengthens boundaries, and sharpens the timing of storm development. Even modest differences in the position or speed of these waves can alter where the strongest storms form. But the broader message remains stable when multiple forecast systems agree on the same configuration. Agreement matters because upper-level patterns govern so much of what follows. When the trough shape, its embedded waves, and its associated wind maxima align across forecast guidance, confidence rises, not because every detail is known, but because the skeleton of the event is well defined. In a case like this, the upper atmosphere does not merely permit bad weather. It organizes the schedule. It determines when one region comes under stronger ascent, when another enters the dry and windy flank, and when colder air wraps farther south. The jet stream itself becomes part of this architecture. Jet streaks, which are localized zones of stronger wind within the larger jet, can create favored regions for ascent, depending on their orientation and position. Air tends to speed up as it enters these stronger segments and adjust again as it exits. And those adjustments help shape where rising motion is enhanced. In practical terms, that means the upper pattern is not smooth. It has pockets of added momentum that intensify certain sectors of the system. The surface map tells where the ingredients are placed. The upper map tells when the atmosphere begins to use them. Another important aspect of the trough is its tilt and depth. A deeper trough usually indicates a stronger intrusion of colder air aloft and a more vigorous circulation, while the orientation of the trough affects how quickly energy transfers eastward and how the surface system responds. When the trough holds enough amplitude and enough embedded energy, the result is a prolonged period of active weather rather than a brief passage. That persistence is one of the central features of this event. The system does not relax after one cycle because the upper support remains present and the atmosphere beneath it continues to respond. In that sense, the upper trough is the hidden framework of the entire pattern. Surface maps show the visible expressions, but the sustaining logic sits above them in the slow curvature of the flow, in the repeated release of embedded disturbances, in the placement of stronger winds, and in the steady supply of colder air aloft over warmer air below. What happens at ground level depends heavily on these upper decisions. The trough does not need to be seen directly to shape nearly every hazard under it. Its influence is carried through wind temperature, pressure tendency, and vertical motion, and together those elements give the whole event its unusual continuity. Instead of a single rise and fall, the atmosphere enters a prolonged, organized state, held in place by the architecture of the flow above the continent. From the Gulf of Mexico, the lower atmosphere sends northward a steady stream of warmth and moisture, and this transport becomes one of the central reasons the larger pattern remains active over several days instead of fading after a single burst. Moisture in weather is not simply a matter of humid air at the surface. It is part of a continuous exchange of energy and mass carried by wind and shaped by pressure differences across great distances. In this case, the Gulf acts as the nearest large reservoir of marine air, warm enough and moist enough to feed the interior of the continent during spring. South winds near the surface and in the lower few thousand feet begin to draw that air inland first across the coastal plain and then farther north into the Mississippi Valley and the southern plains. As the flow continues, dew points rise, the depth of the moist layer increases, and the atmosphere near the ground becomes less dense relative to the air above it when heating and lift are later applied. This is why forecasters treat moisture return as a process, not as single observation. One humid afternoon does not create a prolonged, severe pattern by itself. What matters is duration, depth, and continuity. The Gulf supply in this setup does not arrive in a brief pulse and then retreat. It keeps moving hour after hour, replenishing the lower atmosphere after each round of storms uses part of the available energy. The land between the Gulf Coast and the plains offers a long corridor for that movement, and the broad openness of the central United States allows the flow to extend northward without being blocked by major east to west mountain barriers. That geography is essential. It permits the warm sector of the system to widen and persist. Marine air crosses wetlands, farmland, river valleys, and open grassland carrying latent heat. The stored energy associated with water vapor into regions that may later become favorable for explosive ascent. Once moisture reaches these inland areas, its effects multiply. Nighttime temperatures tend to remain milder because humid air cools differently from dry air. Morning cloud layers and low stratus can develop as air near the ground approaches saturation. The lower atmosphere becomes heavier with water vapor, and that changes the thermal and mechanical character of the environment. When lifted, humid air releases heat through condensation, making it more buoyant than it would be in a drier state. That release of heat is one of the quiet engines inside a thunderstorm updraft. It helps rising air keep rising. Without sufficient moisture, even strong lifting can produce clouds and rain with limited intensity. With a deep and persistent moisture supply, the same lifting can produce far more vigorous vertical motion. In this pattern, the Gulf Stream of air is therefore not an accessory to the outbreak. It is the fuel line. The pressure pattern at the surface helps maintain that fuel line. Lower pressure over the plains and central states, together with relatively higher pressure to the southeast and over the Gulf, supports a broad south to north flow. At times, that flow intensifies into a low-level jet, a corridor of faster wind, a short distance above the surface. This feature is especially important at night, when frictional effects near the ground diminish, and the lower atmosphere can accelerate more efficiently. The result is a nocturnal reinforcement of moisture transport. While the surface world becomes dark and still, the air a little above the ground can carry even more moisture northward. This helps explain why the environment does not simply recover weakly between days. It is being recharged overnight. The Gulf connection also affects the vertical structure of the atmosphere by deepening the moist layer. A shallow ribbon of humidity near the ground can be mixed out or displaced easily. A deeper plume is harder to remove. It supports cloud formation over a greater depth, lowers cloud bases in favorable areas, and contributes to a more robust warm sector ahead of fronts and dry lines. When forecasters examine such a setup, they look not only at surface dew points, but also at the quality of the moisture through the lower atmosphere, because that depth influences storm mode, storm intensity, and the ability of the environment to sustain repeated development. The source region matters as well. Water temperatures over the Gulf, the recent history of air moving across that water, and the path the air takes inland all influence how much moisture arrives and how warm it remains during transport. As the air advances northward, it does not move in a straight, isolated ribbon. It interacts with terrain, with river valleys, with older boundaries left behind by previous storms, and with the daily cycle of heating and cooling over land. Yet despite these local complications, the broader signal stays intact. Moisture keeps returning. The warm sector stays supplied. the atmosphere remains primed. This continuity is one reason a multi-day event can feel less like a series of separate storms and more like one long unfolding process. Even where storms have already passed, the Gulf can begin restoring the lower atmosphere soon afterward. In the absence of that restoration, earlier convection might stabilize the region enough to suppress later severe development. With it, the atmosphere can recover faster and prepare for another round. The same moisture stream also helps explain why hazards appear in different forms across distant regions. Where the air is forced upward gently and repeatedly over broad areas, it can contribute to soaking rain and rising rivers. Where it collects beneath colder air aloft and near stronger boundaries, it can help support violent thunderstorms. In both cases, the substance is the same. Water vapor moves inland from the Gulf and enters a larger circulation that distributes it according to local structure. This transport has a calm appearance on a map often shown as shaded values and wind arrows, but it represents a vast movement of energy across the continent. It turns the lower atmosphere into a reservoir waiting for lift. It softens the boundary between day and night by continuing after sunset. It makes the difference between an active setup and a self-sustaining one. The moisture stream is therefore not merely present beneath the pattern. It is one of the pattern's most faithful and persistent motions, carrying the Gulf northward into the center of the country and keeping the atmosphere supplied for what follows within the same broad system. Over the central United States, one of the most important boundaries in warm season weather takes shape not as a coastline, a mountain wall or a visible front in the ordinary sense, but as a narrow zone separating two very different kinds of air. This is the dry line, a boundary between warm, moist air advancing from the Gulf of Mexico and hotter, much drier air spreading eastward from the elevated interior of the Southwest. On a map, it may appear as only a subtle kink in moisture values, yet in the lower atmosphere, it marks a striking contrast in density, humidity, visibility, and cloud potential across a relatively short distance. On one side, the air feels heavier with moisture, cloud bases sit lower, and the landscape often carries a softer appearance beneath haze or thin cloud. On the other side, the air is clearer, drier, and better mixed through depth, with stronger heating and a deeper boundary layer extending upward from the ground. These differences are not superficial. They shape how air rises, how clouds form, and where storms can begin. The dry line exists because the geography of North America favors the meeting of these two air masses in the plains. To the west, elevated terrain helps create and maintain dry continental air that descends and warms as it moves off the higher ground. To the east and southeast, lower elevation and open access to the Gulf allow marine moisture to spread inland. Between them lies a corridor where the contrast sharpens day after day. Unlike a cold front, which usually represents air masses with a large temperature difference, the dry line is defined mainly by moisture. Temperatures on both sides may be warm, and sometimes the drier side is even hotter in the afternoon because dry air heats efficiently under sunlight. What separates the two is the amount of water vapor carried in the lower atmosphere. That difference matters because moist air and dry air respond very differently to lifting. Moist air can condense sooner, form clouds at lower levels, and release heat as water vapor changes phase. Dry air resists cloud formation until it is lifted much farther. As a result, the dry line becomes a natural focusing mechanism. It places air that is ready to produce cloud and storm development directly beside air that is deeply mixed and able to push against it. Through the day, sunlight heats the ground and deepens mixing on the dry side. That mixing helps the drier air spread eastward near the surface, sometimes causing the boundary to sharpen and surge. Moist air on the east side often remains somewhat cooler and denser near the ground, especially where evapotranspiration from vegetation and continuing moisture, advection, maintain higher humidity. The meeting of these flows creates low-level convergence, meaning air near the surface comes together along the boundary and has nowhere to go except upward. That upward motion may begin quietly, as little more than a line of rising thermals and developing cumulus clouds. But the physical importance of the line is already established. It is taking a broad, warm sector and narrowing the most favorable lifting into a smaller zone. The dry line also behaves differently from a front because it can mix eastward during the afternoon and retreat westward at night as the surface layer cools. This daily rhythm gives it a living quality on the weather map. It advances, tightens, and relaxes according to the balance between large-scale flow and local daytime heating. In a strong pattern, however, the line does not simply wander without consequence. It becomes a repeating corridor of initiation. Forecast offices pay close attention to its exact position because a shift of a few counties east or west can determine where the first mature storms rise. Its narrowness is part of its power. A wide, diffuse zone spreads lift too broadly. A sharp, narrow boundary concentrates it. The air parcels closest to the line receive a focused push upward, and if the surrounding environment is favorable, towering clouds can grow rapidly. Once that push breaks through any remaining cap, the layer of warmer air aloft that delays convection. The dry line therefore acts as both separator and trigger. It keeps unlike air masses apart for much of the day, preserving contrast, and then, under the right timing, it becomes the place where that stored contrast begins to release itself. This is why the boundary has such a large reputation in plains weather. It is not merely the edge of dry air. It is the place where large horizontal differences in moisture are converted into vertical motion. The sensory change across it can be remarkable. Dew point values may drop sharply over a short drive, haze may vanish, cloud cover may thin, and the wind may shift in direction or become gustier as mixing deepens. Yet the most important change is invisible. The atmosphere on the moist side remains closer to saturation when lifted, while the atmosphere on the dry side favors deeper mixing and stronger heating. Their interaction provides both contrast and mechanical lift. The line may also intersect older outflow boundaries or subtle terrain influences, which can make some segments more active than others. But even without those additions, the dry line is a formidable feature on its own. It is one of the recurring reasons the central United States becomes such a favored region for severe convection in spring. The continent supplies the moisture from the southeast and the dry air from the elevated west, and the dry line marks their nearest terms of contact. In satellite imagery, it may announce itself through a line of clouds or a sudden edge in sky texture. In observations, it appears through sharp changes in humidity and wind. In the deeper logic of the atmosphere, it represents a boundary where air of different origins meets without immediately blending. That delayed blending is essential. It allows the contrast to persist until daytime processes and larger-scale forcing bring the line to life. Once active, the dry line is capable of organizing the first ascent with unusual precision, not because it creates storm energy by itself, but because it places the available lift exactly where the moist and dry worlds press hardest against each other. Instability is the quiet readiness of the atmosphere to rise, and in this pattern, it builds not as a sudden accident, but as a layered accumulation of heat, moisture, and contrast through depth. A stable atmosphere resists vertical motion. When a parcel of air is nudged upward, it becomes cooler than the air around it and tends to sink back toward its starting level. An unstable atmosphere behaves differently. A parcel that begins to rise may remain warmer than its surroundings, and because warmer air is less dense, it continues upward with less resistance. This simple difference between resistance and release governs much of severe weather, yet the process that creates strong instability is subtle. Near the ground, the atmosphere gains warmth from sunlight absorbed by the land surface and from the ongoing arrival of warm, humid air from the south. Above that warm layer, cooler air spreads in from the larger circulation aloft. The result is a vertical contrast. Warmer and more humid low-level air beneath cooler mid-level air. That contrast matters because the atmosphere becomes easier to overturn when the lower layer contains more heat and moisture than the air above it. Meteorologists often describe the available upward energy with the term convective, available potential energy, usually shortened to CAPE. It measures how much buoyant energy a rising parcel can gain after it becomes free to accelerate upward. The concept sounds technical, but its meaning is straightforward. Higher values indicate an atmosphere with more stored potential for strong updrafts. In ordinary, unsettled weather, modest instability can produce scattered showers or thunderstorms. In a more energized pattern, larger values indicate that once air begins rising in earnest, it may do so with extraordinary vigor. That vigor is what allows storm towers to deepen rapidly, hail to remain suspended, and grow, and rainfall to be carried high into the storm before descending. CAPE does not guarantee severe weather by itself, but it describes how much fuel is waiting if a storm can tap it. In this event, the atmosphere becomes primed because several processes build that fuel at once. Surface warmth increases through daylight hours. Moisture deepens in the lower atmosphere. Colder air aloft overspreads the region. Each element reinforces the others. Warmth alone can produce rising air, but dry warmth is often mixed and limited. Moisture alone can make the air feel heavy and humid, but without enough temperature contrast aloft, it may not yield strong buoyancy. Cooler air aloft alone creates a steeper lapse rate, the rate at which temperature falls with height, but without low-level warmth and moisture, the effect remains incomplete. Together, however, these ingredients create a much more responsive vertical profile. A parcel lifted from near the ground cools as it rises, but if it begins warm and moist, enough condensation starts at a relatively low altitude, cloud develops, and latent heat is released. That release keeps the parcel warmer than it otherwise would be, preserving its upward acceleration. In a very unstable environment, the parcel then enters a layer where it becomes substantially warmer than the surrounding air and can surge skyward. This is why instability is often described as stored energy. The atmosphere may appear calm at the surface in the early part of the day, yet the profile above already contains the ingredients for rapid vertical motion once the right trigger arrives. Another important element is the cap, a layer of warmer air aloft that prevents ordinary daytime thermals from rising freely into deep convection. At first glance, the cap seems like a suppressing feature, and in one sense, it is. It can delay storm formation for hours. Yet in severe weather setups, it often plays a constructive role by preventing the atmosphere from spending its energy too early. Without a cap, many weak storms might form by midday, interfere with one another, and reduce the overall potential for intense discrete development later. With a cap in place, heat and moisture continue to collect beneath it. The lower atmosphere grows more buoyant while the lid holds. Then, when stronger lift finally weakens the cap or breaks through it, the release can be abrupt and powerful. In that sense, the cap acts less like an obstacle and more like a timing mechanism. It allows the atmosphere to store its energy until the moment when boundaries or larger-scale ascent make storm initiation more focused. This stored character is one reason spring's severe weather can feel disproportionate. The sky may remain only partly active while the lower atmosphere continues charging. By late afternoon, values of instability may have climbed far beyond what the morning appearance of the sky would suggest. The environment becomes primed, not because every place is storming, but because many places are waiting. Local differences in cloud cover, soil moisture, and wind mixing can modify the exact distribution of energy, yet the broad warm sector still acquires a reservoir of buoyancy. Even where clouds drift overhead, moisture can preserve instability by keeping the low-level air rich in water vapor. Over open ground, stronger heating can deepen the mixed layer and sharpen gradients. The details vary, but the larger field of stored energy remains. This is the atmospheric background against which severe storms develop. A thunderstorm in such an environment is not drawing only on surface warmth from one county or 1 hour. It is tapping a column that has been prepared through transport heating and cooling across depth. CAPE is the numerical expression of that preparation, but the physical story is more textured. Warm ground, humid air cooler. Middle levels, a supportive lapse rate, and a cap holding the system in check all combine to create an atmosphere that is not yet in motion, but is ready for motion. When forecasters say the environment is primed, they mean that the vertical profile has shifted from ordinary spring variability into a state where ascent can become explosive once it begins. Instability is therefore not the storm itself. It is the stored permission for the storm to grow fast, high, and powerfully when the atmosphere finally decides to let that stored energy rise. Wind shear gives shape to the rising storm, and in an environment already rich with moisture and instability, it becomes the factor that determines whether convection remains disorganized or develops into long-lived rotating structures. Shear is the change in wind speed or wind direction with height. Near the ground, winds may blow from the south or southeast, carrying warm and humid air into the lower atmosphere. A little higher, the flow may turn toward the southwest and become faster. Higher still, it may strengthen further and lean toward the west. This gradual turning and increase of speed through depth creates a three-dimensional wind pattern that affects every parcel of air rising through it. Without meaningful shear, an updraft tends to rise vertically and then collapse back into its own rain-cooled downdraft. The storm chokes on itself. Precipitation falls through the rising column. Cool air spreads outward, and the structure weakens before it can organize. With sufficient shear, the updraft and downdraft begin to separate. Rain and hail are carried away from the core of rising air, rather than falling directly back through it. This separation allows the updraft to remain cleaner and more durable, and that durability is one of the foundations of severe storm behavior. The storm does not merely rise. It begins to organize its internal motions in a more efficient way. Directional shear, the turning of wind with height, also creates horizontal spin in the atmosphere before any storm forms. One may imagine invisible tubes of rotation lying roughly parallel to the ground, generated by layers of air moving in different directions or at different speeds. When a thunderstorm updraft grows within such an environment, it can tilt some of that horizontal rotation into the vertical. Once the spin is oriented upward, the storm may begin to rotate around its own rising core. This rotating updraft is called a mesocyclone. The term sounds specialized, yet it describes a simple physical change. The storm stops being only a tall rising tower and becomes a structured circulation with organized inflow, organized ascent, and persistent internal rotation. This change matters because rotation can strengthen the storm's ability to survive. As air spirals inward and upward, pressure may fall within the core inflow, can become more focused, and the storm can sustain itself longer than ordinary convection would allow. In this way, the environment outside the storm writes itself into the structure inside the storm. A supercell, the classic rotating thunderstorm, does not arise from buoyancy alone. It requires a wind profile that supports persistent rotation through depth. Speed shear is equally important. When winds increase with height, the storm gains a mechanism for venting its upper levels and separating its precipitation field from its main updraft. Stronger upper winds can spread the storm top downstream, allowing the vertical column beneath to remain vigorous rather than smothered. At lower levels, the exact shape of the wind profile becomes especially important. Forecasters often examine the lowest 1,000 to 3,000 feet with great care because rotation near the ground depends strongly on how air enters the storm in this part of the atmosphere. When the flow there is both moist and strongly curved in direction, parcels entering the storm can carry substantial streamwise vorticity, meaning the air already contains spin aligned with its path into the updraft. This alignment makes it easier for the storm to concentrate and intensify rotation. The low-level jet often plays a major role. As a corridor of stronger winds develops a short distance above the surface, it increases transport of moisture while also enhancing shear in the same layer where storms take in their inflow. A storm rooted in such an environment may deepen its rotation through the evening, even if surface heating begins to fade. The result is an atmosphere in which storm organization can improve after sunset rather than diminish. Rotation inside a storm does not guarantee a tornado. Many mesocyclones never tighten enough or never interact with the near-surface environment in the way required for a tornado to form. Still, the presence of strong shear raises the ceiling of what the storm can become. It supports very large hail by maintaining a long-lived intense updraft. It supports damaging winds by organizing downdrafts and allowing momentum from higher levels to be transported downward. It supports longevity, enabling a single storm to travel many miles while remaining severe. In the most favorable cases, it supports the concentration of rotation into a smaller and more intense vortex near the ground. The details of that final process remain complex and depend on storm-scale interactions among rain-cooled air inflow pressure changes and boundary layer structure. Yet none of those smaller details occur in isolation from the larger wind field. Shear creates the storm's architecture before the storm refines it internally. The atmosphere therefore becomes not only energetic but arranged. That arrangement is what severe weather forecasts seek to identify. High instability with weak shear may produce tall but short-lived storms. Strong shear with very little instability may create lines of showers or elevated convection with limited severe potential. When both elements overlap, the environment becomes far more concerning because the storm can rise powerfully and remain organized as it does so. This overlap is often most effective near important boundaries, where inflow is backed more strongly at the surface, meaning winds turn slightly more from the southeast rather than the south. That subtle change lengthens the curve in the lowest wind profile and can increase the ease with which a storm acquires rotation. Thus, the wind field is not only strong, it is shaped in a way that matters. The storm responds to that shape almost immediately once it matures. Rain wraps differently. Inflow channels more clearly. The cloud base may lower in portions of the circulation as pressure falls locally and moisture condenses. The whole storm takes on a more deliberate internal order. Shear is the reason this order emerges. It turns a simple vertical plume into a rotating system with memory and persistence. In a pattern like this, where the lower atmosphere is already moist and unstable, the presence of strong shear does not merely support thunderstorms. It determines that some of them will carry rotation as an integral part of their structure, and that rotation becomes one of the most important pathways through which the atmosphere expresses its stored energy. After sunset, the atmosphere does not necessarily become calmer. In a strongly forced severe weather pattern, the most dangerous hours may begin only when the visible signs have become harder to read. This nighttime danger emerges from a combination of physical and human factors that overlap in a particularly unforgiving way. During the day, solar heating helps build instability near the surface, and many people naturally associate thunderstorms with the warm, bright hours of the afternoon. That association holds for many ordinary showers and local summer storms, but organized severe convection follows a broader set of controls. Once a storm system is supported by strong, large-scale lift, abundant low-level moisture, and a favorable wind profile through depth, the loss of sunlight does not remove the environment that sustains it. In some cases, the structure becomes even more supportive after dark. A central reason is the behavior of the boundary layer, the lowest part of the atmosphere directly influenced by the ground. During daylight, surface friction and mixing distribute momentum unevenly and create a rougher vertical structure near the ground. After sunset, the ground cools. The lower atmosphere begins to stabilize close to the surface, and the deeper mixed layer collapses. Above that shallow, stable layer, winds often strengthen into a low-level jet, a ribbon of faster-moving air a short distance off the ground. This increase in wind speed matters because it enhances moisture, transport, strengthens shear, and improves the ability of storms to maintain organized inflow. Air continues to stream northward into active storms, even while the surface world seems quieter. The result is a strange contrast between human perception and atmospheric reality. At ground level, the landscape grows darker and more still. Above it, the flow feeding severe convection may actually become more efficient. Storms that survive into evening can therefore maintain or intensify their internal organization during the night. Rotation may become more favorable rather than less favorable. Inflow may become deeper and more focused. The storm does not rely only on fresh daytime heating. It relies on the continued presence of instability above the shallow cooling layer and on the strengthening low-level wind field that feeds it. This is why nighttime severe weather has a reputation for being especially lethal. The atmosphere retains its capacity for violence, while the visual world offers far fewer clues. In daylight, many people recognize the darkening base of a storm, the lowering cloud, the fast motion of rain curtains, or the sudden green cast that sometimes accompanies hail and heavy precipitation. At night, those cues are largely absent. Rain and cloud become part of the darkness. Rotation can no longer be judged by eye, except in the rare flashes of lightning, and even then, the view is brief and incomplete. The storm becomes something heard more than seen, and sound usually arrives too late to serve as an early warning. Human behavior under these conditions changes sharply. Many people are asleep indoors or no longer following continuous weather information after the long attention of the afternoon and evening. Phones may be silenced. Notification settings may limit urgent alerts. Weather radios may not be active in every household. The time between warning and impact can therefore shrink not only in the atmosphere, but in human response. A warning that might lead to immediate sheltering at 4 in the afternoon may go unheard or unprocessed at 2 in the morning. Fatigue also becomes part of the risk. In a multi-day outbreak, communities may have already spent hours under watches, hearing sirens monitoring updates or sheltering from earlier storms. Vigilance weakens as the night deepens. This is not carelessness. It is a normal limit of human attention. The atmosphere does not observe that limit. Storms continue according to the structure around them, and organized overnight convection often moves into regions where people have already spent much of the day managing earlier hazards. Another problem lies in the way radar observes storms. Weather radar scans the atmosphere in beams that rise with distance from the radar site because of Earth's curvature and the fixed elevation angles used for scanning. Far from the radar, the beam may be sampling several thousand feet above the ground, rather than the lowest levels where tornadoes actually form. In daylight, trained spotters or visual confirmation can supplement that limitation. At night, that visual confirmation is often unavailable. A storm may contain strengthening low-level rotation that is difficult to observe directly at the time when public dependence on official detection is greatest. Radar remains an essential and powerful tool, but its practical limitations become more consequential when darkness removes the other layer of awareness that daylight provides. Storm mode also tends to evolve during the evening. Discrete supercells, which begin as individual rotating storms with clearer structure, may later merge into clusters or lines. Embedded rotation inside a larger line of storms can be harder to diagnose and harder for the public to interpret. The threat no longer appears as one isolated storm on the horizon. It becomes part of a broader shield of rain and wind in which smaller, dangerous circulations may be hidden. Heavy precipitation can wrap around areas of rotation, making them less visible and sometimes reducing the time available to recognize the threat, even on radar. In rural areas, the nighttime danger increases further because communication gaps longer travel distances, and limited shelter options can delay protective action. In urban and suburban areas, dense populations and indoor noise can create a different problem, where many people remain physically close to danger but disconnected from live weather awareness. The night, therefore, changes the severe weather environment twice. It modifies the atmosphere in a way that can strengthen shear and maintain storm organization, and it modifies society in a way that reduces warning response and situational awareness. These two changes overlap in the same hours. That overlap is the essence of nighttime storm danger. The storms continue to draw on moisture lift and organized wind. The people beneath them lose sight, lose context, and often lose time. Nothing about this makes the night mystical or unpredictable. Its danger is grounded in clear physical and human realities. A strongly organized storm after dark remains a machine of rotating air, rain, hail, and wind moving through an environment that still supports it. Darkness does not weaken that machine. It removes the easiest ways of noticing it, and that quiet removal is what makes the nighttime phase of a severe outbreak so persistently dangerous. The sequence of the outbreak unfolds less like a single storm crossing the country and more like a shifting corridor of risk that moves from region to region while the broader atmospheric engine remains in place. On the map, the target changes location from day to day, yet the underlying supply of moisture lift and organized wind does not disappear with each passage. It is redistributed within the same large circulation, so the outbreak behaves as a rolling process rather than a one-time event. In the opening phase, the plains hold the greatest focus because the dry line instability axis and favorable wind profile overlap there most directly. The first storms tend to form in a relatively narrow window when daytime heating has fully matured and the cap has weakened enough for rising air to break through. Those early storms often begin as discrete cells separated enough from one another to develop clean inflow and strong internal structure. Because the environment is already primed, they can intensify quickly, producing large hail-damaging winds and the potential for rotating updrafts. Their danger does not come only from local intensity. It comes from timing. They form at the beginning of a broader sequence, which means the atmosphere still has room to evolve after they appear. As evening progresses, some of these storms persist as individual supercells, while others begin to merge into clusters or lines. The hazard character then shifts from isolated intense points to a more continuous swath of severe weather. The overnight hours can support this transition because the low-level jet strengthens and continues feeding the storms even as the surface cools. The target area may nudge eastward, but the process itself remains active. By the following day, the system has not finished. It has reorganized. The cold front and associated forcing advance, and the severe threat often expands or changes shape across the Midwest and adjacent regions. Where the previous day emphasized discrete development near the dry line, the next day may favor a more extensive band of storms, including squall lines capable of carrying damaging straight-line winds across long distances. This is one of the important features of a rolling outbreak. Each day does not simply repeat the one before it. The same larger circulation expresses different storm modes depending on how the boundaries align, how moisture has been redistributed, and how earlier convection has modified the environment. A line of storms can travel for hours, affecting many counties and states in succession, while drawing on the same broad pressure pattern that supported the earlier supercells. The geographical center of concern therefore moves sometimes by hundreds of miles, but the country does not truly exit the severe phase. It only watches the focus slide downstream. Later in the sequence, another day may emerge as the most concentrated period of concern because the ingredients arrive in especially clean alignment. Moisture may be deeper, shear more favorably organized, and lifting boundaries more tightly phased. In those periods, the risk does not merely continue, it sharpens. Forecasters often pay close attention to such pivot points because they represent the moment when several days of preparation in the atmosphere reach a common maximum. The dry line may still play a role, but now it may intersect more directly with the advancing cold front or with residual boundaries left behind by earlier storms. The result is a renewed corridor of severe potential, sometimes farther south, sometimes farther east, but still part of the same system-wide cycle. Another day, then, extends the pattern into the southern flank, where the lingering moisture plume and remaining instability continue to support convection, even as the main mid-latitude forcing begins to translate farther east. This extension matters because it shows that the outbreak is not a fixed box on the weather map. It is a sequence of regions entering and leaving the most dangerous overlap while the overall circulation continues moving. The final stages may no longer emphasize classic severe supercells in the same way as the opening phase. Yet the system can still deliver widespread rain-embedded convection, gusty winds, and renewed flooding concerns over densely populated corridors farther east. The atmosphere, in other words, does not switch suddenly from severe to harmless. It evolves through modes. This rolling character helps explain why public perception often lags behind the science of the event. Many people imagine that once storms pass their area, the outbreak is over. In truth, the outbreak may only be halfway through its continental life cycle. The region at greatest risk changes, but the energy remains within the same broad system, waiting to be expressed again where the next day's overlap becomes strongest. This is also why forecasts several days in advance can become unusually important in such patterns. The value lies not only in identifying one evening of storms, but in recognizing that the atmosphere is entering a multi-day organized state. Preparation then becomes less about one local warning and more about understanding that the national hazard field will continue to migrate. Counties that begin with no threat may enter a high-risk corridor later, while counties that endure the first storms may continue dealing with overnight impacts or the remnants of organized lines after the most intense discrete phase has moved away. Throughout the sequence, the outbreak keeps its identity by maintaining continuity in source and structure. The same upper trough remains influential. The same moisture supply continues northward. The same major boundaries govern where lift becomes focused. What changes is the location of peak overlap and the resulting form of convection. That is why the map seems to move while the event itself remains singular. The rolling outbreak timeline is therefore not a list of unrelated weather days. It is one extended atmospheric progression in which each phase inherits the conditions created by the one before it and passes altered conditions into the one after it. Seen this way, the outbreak becomes easier to understand. It is a moving target held together by a stable engine, a national-scale sequence in which risk travels across the landscape without ever fully shutting down until the larger circulation finally weakens or exits. The first storms of a multi-day outbreak do more than announce that the pattern is active. They begin to reshape the atmosphere for what follows, leaving behind boundaries, pools of cooler air, moisture, contrasts and pressure adjustments that can influence later rounds of convection in ways both subtle and profound. This process is often called atmospheric priming, and it describes the manner in which one generation of storms modifies the environment for the next. A thunderstorm is not only a vertical tower of rising air, it is also a machine that redistributes temperature, moisture, momentum, and pressure across the lower atmosphere. Rain falls through dry layers and cools the air by evaporation. Downdrafts descend and spread outward once they reach the ground. Gust fronts form where this cooler outflow advances into the warmer air ahead of it. These features may appear secondary to the more dramatic hazards of hail, wind, or rotation, yet they often become the organizing scaffolding for later storm development. When an outflow boundary settles across the plains or the Midwest, it creates a line of convergence where air on either side differs in temperature density and wind direction. If the broader environment remains unstable and moist, that line can become a new focus for rising motion during the next period of heating, or when larger-scale lift arrives. The atmosphere is therefore not reset to a blank state after storms pass. It becomes more structured. In a multi-day event, this accumulated structure matters greatly. The first round may leave several intersecting boundaries across a region, some shallow and local, others extending for many miles. Along these lines, winds may back slightly, moisture may pool, and local instability may increase in narrow corridors where cloud cover has broken and the low-level air has recovered. A later storm forming on such a boundary does not enter the environment that existed at sunrise. It enters an atmosphere already edited by previous convection. This edited atmosphere can be more dangerous because the added boundaries provide localized enhancement to lift and rotation. Even a modest storm moving into a favorable boundary may intensify faster than it otherwise would. One reason is that the denser outflow air from earlier storms can lift warm, moist air more effectively when that air is forced to glide upward along the cooler edge. Another is that wind direction often changes across these boundaries, increasing the local curvature of the low-level wind profile and improving the storm relative inflow for rotating storms. These changes are not always obvious on a broad public map. They may be visible mainly in surface observations, radar fine lines, or mesoscale analysis fields. Yet they can determine where the next significant storm begins and how it behaves in its first hour of life. Atmospheric priming also affects moisture distribution. Heavy rain from early storms can cool some areas and stabilize them temporarily, but nearby zones may experience the opposite effect, especially where the storm outflow concentrates moisture along a boundary without completely undercutting the warm sector. There, dew points may rise in a narrow strip, creating a more favorable corridor for renewed development later in the day. At the same time, early storms can remove some inhibition by weakening the cap in certain places through subtle changes in temperature structure aloft, or by providing residual lift that persists after the main cells have weakened. The result is an environment with more texture and more localized opportunity for intense convection. A major outbreak is often most dangerous, not because each day begins from nothing, but because each day inherits the adjustments created by the previous one. The system learns from itself in a physical sense. It uses the debris of earlier storms as ingredients for new storms. Hail reports and strong early updrafts provide another kind of priming signal. Large hail indicates sustained violent ascent, capable of holding growing ice aloft for a long period. This shows that the atmosphere is not merely humid and unstable in theory. It is already able to support exceptionally strong updrafts in practice. Once that ability has been demonstrated, forecasters know that the environment is not reluctant. It is capable. If later boundaries sharpen and the wind profile remains favorable, the next round may build on the same realized potential. The first storms, therefore, serve as field tests of the atmosphere. They reveal how efficiently parcels accelerate upward, how strongly storms organize, and how responsive the environment is to available triggers. The importance of timing also becomes clearer after the first convection. If storms form earlier than expected, they may spread clouds, an outflow that shift the main threat zone. If they form later and remain more isolated, they may preserve broader instability for evening supercells. Either way, the atmosphere is being prepared in real time. Even weakening storms continue to matter because decaying convection still leaves rain-cooled air, localized pressure rises, and subtle wave-like disturbances in the lower atmosphere. These can merge with the larger boundaries already present and create more complicated zones of convergence. By the second or third day of an outbreak, the surface environment may contain a layered history of previous convective episodes, each leaving traces that influence the next initiation window. This is why multi-day severe patterns can become more intricate rather than more exhausted as they continue. Energy is consumed, but structure is created. Recovery processes then begin almost immediately. South winds bring moisture back into outflow-modified areas. Sunlight returns where cloud cover thins. Larger-scale ascent approaches once more from the parent trough aloft. The atmosphere, instead of settling, starts knitting together a new warm sector around the scars of the old one. In this sense, the early storms are not preliminary noise before the main event. They are part of the main event's internal preparation. They reshape the map of risk from broad potential into narrower but often more potent corridors. They tell forecasters where the atmosphere is already responsive and where important contrasts are sharpening. They transform a simple severe setup into a more self-organizing system, one in which yesterday's convection helps determine today's hazard geometry. Atmospheric priming is therefore one of the main reasons a rolling outbreak can maintain intensity across several days. The first storms do not merely happen within the environment, they change it, and the changed environment becomes the starting point for what comes next. In western New York, the same broad weather pattern expresses itself not through towering rotating storms, but through the quieter and often more persistent mechanics of regional flooding. This form of hazard begins with the hydrologic condition of the land long before the most recent rain arrives. Soil that has already absorbed repeated precipitation loses much of its remaining storage capacity. Streams begin from an elevated baseline, and river channels carry more water than usual even before a new event fully develops. When additional rainfall then spreads across the basin, the effect is not simply additive. It is amplified by everything the landscape can no longer do. Instead of receiving holding and gradually releasing the new water, the ground sheds a larger share of it, quickly into creeks, tributaries, and main river channels. This is why a rainfall total that may appear moderate in isolation can still produce a meaningful flood event when it falls on terrain that has become saturated by earlier systems. The danger in such a setup is not always dramatic at the moment rain is falling. It often unfolds as a cumulative response. Small channels fill first drainage ditches, backup low fields begin to pond, and streams that normally remain within their banks start to rise against bridges, culverts, and floodplain margins. As water continues moving downstream, the larger channels receive this combined runoff from many smaller sources at once. The basin responds as one connected body. Western New York is particularly sensitive to this type of behavior because the region contains many small to medium watersheds, developed suburban corridors, agricultural land, and waterways that can rise efficiently when several tributaries contribute together. Terrain also matters. Even modest slopes can accelerate runoff when soil is already wet, and valley bottoms become collection zones where water lingers after the rainfall has ended. The result is not always a sudden wall of water. It is often a steady filling of the landscape. Parks near rivers become lakes. Roadside ditches overflow into low pavement. Basements begin taking in groundwater or backflow. Fields disappear beneath shallow sheets of water that move slowly but spread widely. This style of flooding is easy to underestimate because it lacks the dramatic vertical violence of a tornado or the visual grandeur of a blizzard. Yet it affects daily life with great persistence. Roads close not because they are destroyed, but because even a small depth of moving water makes them unsafe. Neighborhood access changes. Emergency services reroute around submerged crossings. Residents in low-lying areas spend long hours watching gauges pumps. And forecasts rather than a brief window of impact followed by immediate relief. River flooding is a time-integrated hazard. It reflects not only the rain that is falling now, but the memory of all the rain that has fallen before. Hydrologists think in terms of antecedent conditions, meaning the state of the land and channels before the current event begins. In a saturated basin, those antecedent conditions are already primed for response. Infiltration rates decline, storage in the upper soil layers is reduced, and water that would otherwise soak downward is redirected laterally toward drainage networks. This process is often called runoff amplification, and it explains why flood stage can be approached or exceeded with unsettling efficiency, even when the latest rainfall event is not extreme in absolute terms. Urban and suburban surfaces intensify the effect. Pavement, rooftops, parking areas, and compacted ground increase the proportion of rainfall that runs off directly rather than entering the soil. Storm drains can help route that water away quickly, but when channels downstream are already high, rapid drainage becomes less helpful because the receiving system has limited capacity. Water then backs into streets, underpasses, and low intersections. Rural areas face a related but different problem. Saturated fields lose their ability to hold new rain, and small streams that thread through farmland rise into culverts and local roads. The hazard spreads through ordinary places rather than spectacular ones. Another important feature of regional flooding is delay. Rain may peak during one period while rivers continue rising long afterward, as tributary inflow works its way through the watershed. This lag can create a false sense of improvement. Skies begin to brighten, but the water level at gauge points may still be climbing. People often interpret the end of rainfall as the end of danger, yet river systems obey travel time rather than appearance. Water that fell miles upstream may still be moving toward downstream communities hours later. For this reason, flood response depends heavily on monitoring and projection. River gauges, basin models, and local experience become as important as radar was during the storm itself. Emergency managers watch not only present levels, but rates of rise, because the speed of increase can indicate how much stress will fall on low-lying neighborhoods, bridges, and infrastructure. The physical logic remains tied to the larger atmospheric system. The same moisture-laden circulation that supports severe weather farther west also delivers broad precipitation into the Great Lakes region. There, instead of being converted primarily into violent convection, the water becomes part of a slower but expansive hydrologic response. This is why the flooding is not a separate weather story. It is the same system translated through a different landscape and a different set of local thresholds. In one region, the atmosphere spends its energy through buoyancy and rotation. In another, it spends it through accumulation, runoff, and channel rise. Western New York becomes a place where the event is measured in gauge heights, inundated floodplains, and the duration of standing water rather than in hail size or wind speed. The scientific principles are no less rigorous for being quieter. Soil saturation, basin integration, runoff efficiency, and floodplain occupancy determine the outcome with steady precision. Water follows gravity, storage limits, and channel geometry, and when those limits have already been tested by previous rain, even an additional ordinary pulse can produce extraordinary consequences. Regional flooding therefore emerges as the hydrologic language of the same continental pattern, a slower-moving but deeply consequential expression of atmospheric excess across a landscape that can no longer absorb what the sky continues to send. On the cold side of the same continental system, the atmosphere expresses its energy through snow wind and prolonged exposure rather than through towering convection. Here the key process is not the rapid overturning of warm, moist air into thunderstorms, but the wrapping and deepening of colder air behind the main circulation, where the vertical temperature structure remains below freezing through enough of the column for precipitation to fall as snow. This region often lies to the north and northwest of the surface, low and beneath the backside of the upper trough, where colder air is drawn southward and then wrapped cyclonically around the system. The result is a broad sector in which lift moisture and cold overlap for many hours. Snowfall in such a pattern does not require an isolated winter storm detached from the spring outbreak farther south. It is one branch of the same circulation, one expression of the same pressure and wind field acting on a different thermal environment. Cold air alone does not guarantee significant snow. The atmosphere must also provide moisture and sustained lift. In this case, both are present. Moisture circulating around the system rises over colder air, and as it ascends, it cools further, condensing into cloud and precipitation. When the depth of sub-freezing air is sufficient, snow crystals survive their journey to the surface. If lift is strong and prolonged accumulation becomes substantial. If wind strengthens at the same time, the snow is no longer simply falling. It is being transported, redistributed, and lifted again after it lands, reducing visibility and increasing the burden on travel and infrastructure. This is how the cold flank of the system can approach blizzard conditions even while warmer sectors produce flooding and severe thunderstorms elsewhere. The geography of the northern plains and the interior west helps intensify the practical effect. Open country allows wind to move snow across long fetches with little interruption, so visibility can deteriorate far beyond the intensity of falling snow alone. Roads that appear only lightly snow-covered may drift rapidly as loose, dry snow piles into lanes around vehicles and against buildings or fences. In higher terrain and foothill regions, lifting by the land itself can also enhance precipitation, adding to totals in favored zones. Yet, even across flatter country, the combination of wind and snowfall creates a distinctive hazard. A blizzard is not defined only by accumulation. It is defined by the persistence of strong wind with falling or blowing snow severe enough to reduce visibility for an extended time. This means the danger is sensory and logistical as much as thermodynamic. People lose horizon road edge and depth cues. Travel slows, then stops. Rescue becomes more difficult because location itself becomes uncertain in open terrain. Agricultural operations are disrupted because feed access, transport routes, and exposure risks all worsen at once. Another important feature of spring blizzards is timing within the seasonal calendar. By April, many communities have already entered a transitional state. Winter equipment may still exist, but readiness is psychologically and sometimes operationally lower than it was in midwinter. People begin planning around thaw rather than renewed snowpack. Livestock may already be managed under assumptions of milder conditions. Daytime warmth in prior days can make the return of heavy snow seem less credible until it is underway. This seasonal mismatch does not alter the physics of the storm, but it does alter vulnerability. Snow falling in a landscape that has begun to transition into spring can place unusual stress on transportation schedules, exposed animals, and infrastructure not being watched with peak winter vigilance. The cold side of the circulation also contains a more complex vertical structure than might appear at first glance. In some zones, a warm layer may intrude aloft and create mixed precipitation, while farther north or west, the column remains fully cold and supports all snow. The exact placement of these layers determines whether a community receives heavy wet snow dryer, blowing snow sleet, or freezing rain. But in the core blizzard region, the atmospheric profile favors snow through a deep enough layer that accumulation and blowing become the dominant concern. Wind strengthens here because the pressure gradient on the backside of the system often tightens as the low deepens and colder air surges in behind it. This creates a corridor where air accelerates across the landscape while the snow shield continues overhead. The storm then becomes a machine of persistence. Snow falls, snow drifts, visibility falls. And the temperature remains low enough to preserve the hazard rather than melting it away. On this side of the system, motion is measured differently from the warm sector. Instead of fast updrafts and rapidly rotating clouds, the key motions are horizontal transport near the ground and broad ascent through the cold conveyor of the storm. Instead of hailstones cycling in, an updraft, snow crystals aggregate descend and are lifted again by wind after reaching the surface. Instead of a short, intense corridor of damage, there may be a wide zone of prolonged disruption. Power infrastructure feels the stress of wind and heavy accumulation. Rural roads become difficult to maintain open. Small communities can experience periods of partial isolation when travel is discouraged or impossible. Yet this branch of the pattern remains physically linked to the rest of the event. The same upper trough that cools the northern flank also supports lift farther south. The same surface circulation that draws Gulf moisture northward also wraps colder air around the backside. The storm is not changing identity when it produces snow in Montana, Wyoming, or the Dakotas. It is expressing the same identity in a colder region of the circulation. This is why the continental picture feels so expansive. Warm sector violence and cold sector persistence are happening under one governing structure. The blizzard zone is the northern ledger of the same atmospheric account, where energy is spent in long hours of wind-driven snowfall rather than in minutes of tornadic rotation. Snow, once it settles into this cold and windy sector, becomes both precipitation and obstacle, both weather and landscape, altering movement, visibility and exposure, until the circulation finally weakens or shifts away, and the northern branch of the storm releases its hold. Along the western and southwestern side of the broader pattern, the atmosphere produces a very different hazard. One built not from excess moisture, but from a dangerous absence of it, combined with strong wind and ready fuel at the surface. This is the fire weather corridor, where the same circulation that supports thunderstorms on its moist flank and snow on its cold flank instead creates an environment favorable for rapid ignition, fast fire spread, and difficult suppression. The physical ingredients are simple in principle. Air must be dry enough to draw moisture from vegetation and dead grasses. Winds must be strong enough to fan flames, bend them forward, and carry embers beyond the leading edge. Fuels must be available in a state dry enough to burn easily. When these factors overlap across open land, fire behavior can change quickly from manageable to dangerous. In spring, across parts of the plains and interior southwest, that overlap becomes especially important because grasses and light fuels often respond rapidly to short-term atmospheric conditions. Even if deeper vegetation reflects longer seasonal drought, the finer fuels near the surface can become critically dry in a matter of hours under low humidity, strong mixing, and gusty winds. The western flank of a major trough is well suited to producing such conditions. As air descends on this side of the system, it compresses and warms, which lowers relative humidity further. At the same time, the pressure pattern often tightens between the departing low and higher pressure behind it, increasing surface winds over broad regions. The result is a dry, windy environment that may extend for hundreds of miles. In this corridor, the dry line often serves as a dividing boundary between two very different hazard regimes. East of it, moisture and lift support severe storms. West of it, the same boundary marks the edge of deeply mixed dry air, where fire weather intensifies. This contrast is one of the striking features of continental spring weather. Within a relatively short distance, the landscape can shift from hail and tornado potential to a setting where any spark may race through cured grass under powerful gusts. The atmosphere does not view these outcomes as contradictory. They are the natural products of different air masses placed side by side by the same larger circulation. Fire weather depends strongly on relative humidity, because combustion is easiest when fuels have lost much of their moisture to the surrounding air. During the day, sunlight heats the ground and deepens the boundary layer, allowing drier air from aloft to mix down to the surface. This process can cause humidity to fall rapidly through late morning and afternoon, especially over bare ground, short vegetation, and open plains where turbulent mixing is strong. Winds often increase at the same time because the deeper mixed layer taps faster flow from above. Thus, the period of peak dryness often overlaps with the period of peak gustiness, creating the most hazardous burning window. If fuels are already stressed by drought or repeated dry episodes, their moisture content may be low enough that flames spread almost immediately after ignition. In grassland settings, this spread can be extremely fast because fine fuels ignite readily, and fire can move continuously across the surface with little interruption. Wind then becomes more than a background factor. It shapes the flame front, increases oxygen supply, preheats unburned fuel ahead of the fire, and lifts burning fragments into the air. Those embers can start new fires well ahead of the main front, especially where fences, road margins, brush patches, or structures provide receptive fuel. This spotting behavior complicates suppression because the fire no longer behaves as one line. It becomes a field of advancing ignitions connected by wind. Topography can intensify the hazard in certain places. Slopes allow fire to move uphill more quickly because flames tilt closer to unburned fuel above them. But even relatively flat country can support severe fire behavior when winds are strong and fuels are continuous. In many plains regions, the openness of the land permits gusts to remain effective over long distances, and dry grasses provide the continuity a fire needs to keep moving. Agricultural areas face additional concerns because machinery-controlled burns vehicles and power infrastructure can all become ignition sources under critical conditions. A small roadside spark that would be inconsequential on a humid day can become the start of a rapidly spreading grass fire in this environment. Another important aspect of fire weather is that it often follows a period of reduced precipitation or broader drought, meaning the atmosphere is interacting with a landscape that has already been prepared for burning. Drought lowers the moisture content of both fine and heavier fuels over time, while dormant grasses from previous seasons provide abundant surface material. When the large-scale weather pattern then adds strong wind and very low humidity, the fire potential rises sharply. Yet, even in these conditions, not every place burns. The outcome depends on local fuel continuity, recent rainfall history, land use, and the timing of ignition. This is why fire weather forecasting focuses on potential rather than certainty. The atmosphere creates a window in which fire growth could become extreme if ignition occurs. That conditional nature does not make the hazard less serious. It makes it more dependent on prevention and on rapid response once a fire begins. The corridor also reveals another aspect of the same continental system. The atmosphere can create flood risk and fire risk within a few hundred miles of one another, because it is organizing both wet and dry extremes at once. On the moist side, air rises, condenses, and delivers heavy rain. On the dry side, descending and deeply mixed air strips moisture from the land. The contrast can be especially severe where vegetation is already vulnerable and where prior drought has hardened the surface. In some cases, ground that becomes very dry may also become less able to absorb later rainfall, increasing runoff when wetter conditions eventually arrive. But within the fire weather phase itself, the immediate reality is one of dryness, wind, and combustible landscape. Smoke then becomes part of the local atmosphere, reducing visibility and altering air quality, while the fire continues responding to the same gust field that helped create it. Fire weather, in this sense, is the dry language branch of the same storm system, a surface hazard born from atmospheric motion rather than from precipitation. It is the part of the pattern where the sky gives almost nothing to the ground, and that withholding combined with forceful wind becomes the reason the land itself can ignite and carry the event forward in flame. When many different hazards are active across the country at the same time, the atmosphere places pressure not only on the land and the people beneath it, but also on the institutions built to observe, communicate, and respond. This pressure emerges as a form of national alert saturation, a condition in which warnings, watches, advisories, and emergency messages accumulate across many regions. At once, each one locally appropriate, yet collectively difficult for the public and for response systems to process with equal clarity. Weather alerts are designed to be specific. A tornado warning carries one meaning and asks for immediate protective action. A flood warning carries another and directs attention to water roads and low ground. A winter storm warning points toward travel disruption exposure and prolonged cold. A red flag warning signals heightened fire danger and the need for restraint around ignition sources. Each alert is effective when it is received in a context where the associated hazard stands out and the proper response feels legible. The problem begins when many such alerts are active simultaneously over a wide geographic area. At that point, the country no longer experiences a few isolated pockets of concern. It enters a broad field of overlapping urgency in which the warning system itself becomes part of the event's structure. This does not mean the warnings are excessive. It means the hazards are numerous enough that the communication burden grows heavy. Local forecast offices continue to issue what their area requires, but from a continental point of view, the result can look like a map, crowded with many colors, many polygons, and many types of threat all at once. Public understanding becomes harder because the human mind processes danger most easily when one clear hazard dominates the scene. In a simpler event, a household sees the warning recognizes the threat and acts within a familiar script. During a national-scale multi-hazard episode, that script may vary from one state to the next, and even from one daypart to the next. One county thinks about river gauges. Another thinks about snow plows and visibility. Another monitors severe thunderstorm watches, while another looks west for smoke and flame under extreme fire weather. These are all valid responses to the same larger atmospheric system, but the diversity of required actions places unusual strain on public attention. Alert fatigue is one expression of this strain. When notifications arrive repeatedly across long hours or several days, people begin to treat some of them as background rather than signal. This reaction is not irrational. It is a normal response to repeated stimulation. The difficulty is that emergency communication depends on preserving a sharp contrast between routine life and urgent interruption. If interruption becomes continuous, that contrast weakens. A person who has received multiple advisories, watches, or less immediately threatening notices may become slower to appreciate the difference when a truly dangerous warning arrives. In research on hazard communication, this is one of the central challenges of repeated messaging. The problem is not that the messages are false. It is that the environment of attention in which they arrive has become saturated. The same difficulty appears inside institutions. Local emergency managers, state agencies, transportation departments, utility crews and communication teams are all built to handle dangerous weather, but many of their resources are finite and often allocated according to competing needs. In a single hazard event, personnel and equipment can be concentrated more easily. In a multi-hazard event spanning many states, the same broad pool of support may be pulled in different directions at once. Road crews address snow and ice in one area, while another region needs barricades for flooded crossings. Fire agencies watch grasslands under critical wind and humidity, while severe weather teams prepare shelters and warning dissemination elsewhere. Utility providers anticipate different kinds of damage depending on whether the threat is wet snow, straight-line wind floodwater, or wildfire. This does not mean the response system fails. It means the system operates under sustained distributional stress, making prioritization more difficult. Communication also becomes more delicate because language that is appropriate for one hazard may be misleading if mentally transferred to another. A public accustomed to treating weather alerts as advice to remain indoors may not respond correctly when the threat is rising water that can enter the building itself. A region focused on severe thunderstorm updates may overlook the significance of a flood warning that requires a longer but equally serious change in behavior. The challenge is not merely technological, it is interpretive. Warning systems send information efficiently, but the public must still understand what kind of action belongs to what type of hazard. During national alert saturation, that interpretive load increases. The visual presentation of alerts on maps and devices can add another layer of complexity. From a broad perspective, the nation may appear covered in warning colors, yet individual users still need to know which messages matter to their precise location and immediate circumstance. Too little detail risks vagueness. Too much detail risks confusion. The architecture of emergency communication, therefore, becomes part of the scientific story of the event, because atmospheric complexity must be translated into human decisions under time pressure. This translation is especially difficult when hazards arrive in sequence. A household may first receive a watch later, an advisory, then a warning of a different kind hours afterward. What changes from message to message is not only severity, but hazard identity. The public is asked to pivot from one set of protective actions to another while fatigue accumulates. In a long outbreak, these pivots may continue over several days. Institutions face similar continuity problems. Staffing must remain active across shifts. Equipment must be moved, rested, repaired, or reassigned. Public information officers must maintain clarity even when the event's geography and hazard type keep changing. The weather becomes a logistical test as much as a meteorological one. National alert saturation, then, is not simply a count of warnings. It is a condition in which the volume, variety, and duration of hazard communication create a secondary form of risk, rooted in human attention and institutional capacity. The atmosphere sends its signals through tornado potential, flood rise, snowfall, fire weather, and damaging wind. The response system translates those signals into notices, meant to preserve life and reduce harm. When all of those signals arrive at once across a wide country, the translation itself becomes a demanding task. Calm and orderly communication remains possible, but it must work against the natural blurring effect of repetition, variety, and scale. The strain is real, even when the warnings are accurate and the agencies are functioning well, because the system is being asked to manage many different emergencies under one atmospheric roof. In this way, national alert saturation becomes one more consequence of the continental pattern. Not a separate failure of society, but a predictable response burden created when one weather system speaks in many hazard languages at the same time. Above the weather systems moving across the continent, another disturbance can arrive from a completely different source, one not generated within Earth's atmosphere at all, but on the surface of the Sun. This is the domain of space weather, where eruptions of energy and solar material travel outward through interplanetary space and sometimes interact with Earth's magnetic environment. Among the most important of these events is the coronal mass ejection, a large release of magnetized plasma from the Sun's outer atmosphere. When such an ejection is directed toward Earth, it does not behave like wind in the ordinary terrestrial sense. It is a stream of charged particles and magnetic field structure moving through the solar system. After traveling across the distance between Sun and Earth, it can reach the magnetosphere, the region where Earth's magnetic field governs the motion of charged particles. The magnetosphere usually acts as a protective shield, diverting much of the solar flow around the planet. During a stronger event, however, the incoming plasma and magnetic field can compress that shield, inject energy into it, and disturb the electric currents that flow through near-Earth space at the upper atmosphere. This disturbance is called a geomagnetic storm. It is measured through several indices and scales that describe how strongly Earth's magnetic field is being perturbed. The key point is that this process is physically real, measurable, and important, yet separate from the dynamics that produce tornadoes, floods, blizzards, and fire weather. A solar storm does not organize a dry line, deepen a surface low, or increase convective instability in the lower atmosphere. The mechanisms are different. One belongs to heliophysics and magnetospheric physics. The other belongs to meteorology and climate dynamics. Their coexistence in time can feel uncanny, but coincidence of timing does not imply a shared cause. This distinction is essential because solar storms often invite misunderstanding. On one side, they may be dismissed as remote and inconsequential. On the other, they may be exaggerated into a force capable of driving ordinary weather or directly controlling events at the ground in ways not supported by established science. The more careful view lies between those extremes. A geomagnetic storm matters because it affects the upper atmosphere, satellite operations, radio communication, navigation systems, power transmission at high latitudes, and the visibility of auroras. It matters for technology and for the space environment surrounding Earth. It does not need to alter thunderstorms in order to be significant. When the incoming solar magnetic field couples efficiently with Earth's field energy, is transferred into the magnetosphere and down magnetic field lines toward the polar upper atmosphere. There, particles excite atoms and molecules producing auroral light. Oxygen can glow in green or red, while nitrogen contributes other colors depending on altitude and energy. Under stronger conditions, the auroral oval expands equatorward, meaning people much farther from the poles may see luminous curtains or arcs across the night sky. That visual beauty is often the most public-facing sign of a geomagnetic storm, yet it is only one expression of a deeper electrodynamic disturbance. Heating in the upper atmosphere can increase drag on satellites in low orbit. High-frequency radio communication can become less reliable. Navigation accuracy can be degraded in certain conditions. Electric currents induced in long conductors at the surface can affect parts of the power grid, especially in regions more vulnerable to geomagnetically induced current. These effects vary by storm strength, magnetic orientation, latitude, and infrastructure design, but they belong to a well-studied physical chain. The Sun erupts. Plasma travels outward. Earth's magnetic environment responds. The upper atmosphere glows, and technology may experience stress. In the context of a continent already dealing with severe terrestrial weather, the arrival of a solar storm adds a second layer of environmental complexity. It does not change the physics of the weather below, but it changes the total national picture by reminding observers that Earth is embedded in a larger physical system extending beyond air and clouds. The atmosphere has an upper boundary that gradually blends into space. And above that boundary, conditions can become active in ways that remain invisible until their effects appear in auroras, instrument readings, or technical systems. This broader view is scientifically calming rather than alarming. It places the planet within a chain of connected environments, from ground weather to stratosphere, from ionosphere to magnetosphere, from Earth to Sun. A geomagnetic storm is therefore best understood as part of the planet's external energy environment. It arrives not through frontal boundaries or moisture transport, but through magnetic interaction and charged particle flow. During such an event, the night sky itself can become part of the story. In places where clouds clear and artificial light is limited, observers may see faint arcs or more active rippling structures to the north, sometimes extending much farther south than usual. The same evening that one part of the country listens for storm sirens or watches rivers rise, another part may find the upper sky carrying pale moving light from a solar disturbance that began days earlier on the Sun. The coexistence of these experiences can feel symbolically heavy, yet the science remains straightforward. Weather below and space weather above are simultaneous but distinct. One does not need to force them into one mechanism to appreciate their combined presence. Earth receives energy from the Sun in many forms. Some drive the climate over long periods through radiation. Others arrive episodically through solar eruptions and magnetic disturbances. At the same time, Earth's own atmosphere continues to generate its familiar but complex patterns of moisture, wind lift, and temperature contrast. During a period when both domains are active, the planet reveals its layered nature especially clearly. Clouds and storms occupy the lower atmosphere. Charged particles and auroral currents occupy the upper boundary of space near Earth. The human experience of both depends on tools of observation, from radar and satellites to magnetometers and solar telescopes. The solar storm in this sense expands the frame of the narrative without confusing its causes. It reminds the observer that the environment of Earth is not only terrestrial. It includes a magnetic envelope facing a living star, and sometimes that star sends a disturbance that reaches the planet while the weather below continues along entirely separate lines. Beyond the weather itself, the final scale of the event becomes visible in the contrast between Earth's restless lower atmosphere and the controlled precision of a mission preparing to leave it. A crewed launch toward the Moon belongs to a domain of engineering, orbital mechanics, life support, and carefully timed ascent windows. Yet it still begins on the surface of a planet whose atmosphere remains active, variable, and often disruptive. This contrast does not mean the mission is endangered by every storm occurring across the continent. Spaceflight operations are designed around strict local launch weather rules, detailed forecasting, and extensive delay procedures. A launch is not attempted simply because a date exists on a calendar. It is attempted only when the immediate environment around the launch corridor, the pad, the upper air profile, the electrical field, the cloud structure, the precipitation risk, and the recovery logic all satisfy requirements built from hard experience. In that sense, the launch site becomes a place where human planning meets atmospheric reality with unusual discipline. Yet the broader symbolism remains powerful. While one region of the country deals with flooding, another with blizzard conditions, another with fire weather, and another with severe storms after dark, a launch team may be preparing a vehicle to rise through the same planetary atmosphere and leave it behind. The rocket does not ignore weather. It passes through it. During the first minutes of flight, the vehicle must travel through the deepest and most turbulent part of the air, where wind, shear cloud electrification, icing potential, and triggered lightning all matter. Triggered lightning is especially important because a rocket can pass through an electrically sensitive environment and initiate a discharge even when natural lightning is not actively occurring at that moment. This lesson becomes part of launch history decades ago and remains part of launch criteria ever since. Strong upper-level winds also matter because they can impose bending loads on the launch vehicle as it climbs, and those loads must remain within certified structural margins. Rain-thick cloud layers, nearby thunderstorms, and anvil remnants from earlier convection can each create separate constraints. Spaceflight therefore begins not in defiance of weather, but in careful negotiation with it. Once the vehicle rises beyond the denser atmosphere, the logic changes. Aerodynamic forces fall rapidly, the sound of the engines no longer interacts with air in the same way, and the mission transitions from atmospheric ascent into orbital and translunar mechanics. At that point, the great terrestrial outbreak below becomes meteorologically irrelevant to the spacecraft itself. Flooding rivers in New York, snow in Montana, grass fires in the plains, and severe storms in the central states remain human emergencies on the ground, but they do not alter the trajectory to the moon. This separation is scientifically clear and emotionally striking. The same nation can be occupied at once with shelters, river gauges, snowplows, fire lines, and launch countdowns, because each belongs to a different operational layer of life on Earth. The mission team works through checklists, telemetry, fuel loading, guidance logic, and communication loops. Emergency managers elsewhere work through sirens, road closures, warnings, and evacuation routes. Both systems depend on forecasting. Both depend on disciplined response. Yet one is concerned with leaving Earth, and the other with enduring conditions upon it. A lunar mission also highlights how thin the practical boundary is between atmosphere and space. The journey to the moon begins with a violent push through a comparatively shallow shell of air surrounding the planet. Most of the mission distance then lies in near vacuum, where the concerns of weather give way to radiation, spacecraft systems, trajectory corrections, and the geometry of Earth-Moon motion. Earth's atmosphere, so dominant in daily life, becomes a narrow blue layer wrapped around the planet below. From the viewpoint of spaceflight, that layer is both obstacle and protection. It complicates launch through weather and drag, yet it also shields life from much of the harsher environment beyond. During a week of continental extremes, this contrast becomes even more vivid. The atmosphere below appears powerful because it shapes lives, landscapes, and infrastructure through wind, rain, snow, flood, and fire. The same atmosphere viewed from a lunar trajectory is revealed as a delicate envelope, active but thin, energetic, but limited to a small fraction of the space surrounding Earth. The moon itself offers another contrast. It has no weather in the familiar terrestrial sense. No rain falls there, no clouds organize, no fronts cross its surface, no rivers rise, and no forests burn. Its environment is governed instead by vacuum radiation temperature, extremes tied to sunlight and shadow abrasive dust, and the slow record of impacts preserved across geologic time. A mission bound for the Moon therefore travels from one kind of exposure into another. It leaves a dynamic fluid envelope and enters an airless world. This makes the launch feel like a crossing between environmental regimes as much as a movement through distance. On Earth, survival depends on forecasting a moving atmosphere. On the Moon, survival depends on building an artificial habitat against the absence of one. In that sense, the mission does not escape environmental vulnerability. It changes its form. The coincidence of a lunar launch window with a period of extreme national weather also reveals something steady about human systems. Large institutions continue functioning under layered conditions. Meteorologists, launch controllers, mission planners, emergency managers, and local responders all work within their own precise definitions of risk. The same week can contain both planetary ambition and regional fragility. Neither cancels the other. One reflects the reach of engineering and long preparation. The other reflects the persistent authority of Earth's natural systems. Seen together, they create a wider portrait of the planet and its inhabitants. Earth is a world capable of sending astronauts toward another celestial body while still being shaped hour by hour by the movement of air and water across its own surface. The rocket rises through storms only if the local atmosphere permits it, then leaves the weather behind. The people below do not. They remain within the circulation. Within the warnings, within the floodplains, the fire corridors, the snowfields, and the night storms. The mission to the Moon, therefore, becomes the final frame of the story, not because it resolves the unrest below, but because it places that unrest in planetary perspective. The atmosphere that dominates human experience is at once immense to those living within it and very thin when seen from the path to the Moon. And that double truth is where the event comes to rest. The continent settles slowly in the mind as one connected system of contrasts. Warmth rises from the Gulf and travels north through open corridors. Dry air leans east from higher land. Cold wraps downward behind the larger circulation. Moisture gathers in some places and falls into rivers. In others, it lifts into storm towers. Elsewhere, the same pattern strips the ground of humidity and leaves grass ready to burn. Farther north, snow crosses open land under wind. Above it, all the upper flow continues its quiet shaping, guiding motion, timing lift, and giving structure to what seems at first like many separate stories. The weather never truly divides itself the way maps and broadcasts often do. It remains one moving body expressed differently from place to place according to the air, the land, the water, and the season. Beyond the clouds, the planet keeps its wider setting. Earth turns beneath the magnetosphere. The sun sends light every day, and at times disturbances of charged material across space. The Moon circles in its familiar silence, untouched by rainfront, river, or snow. Human life remains between these scales, close to the ground, yet always under larger forces, measuring, forecasting, preparing, adapting. On some weeks, the atmosphere feels especially loud, not because it has changed its nature, but because many of its ordinary powers align at once and reveal their full range across a continent. By the end, nothing mystical is required. Air moves, water changes form, pressure redistributes mass, wind transfers energy, boundaries sharpen and then dissolve. The systems of Earth continue their work with great patience and exactness. To watch them closely is to see motion become pattern, and pattern become weather, and weather become the texture of life beneath the sky.